we wanted to help expose Nebraska students to recognized leaders in the field. The intent, as much as possible, is to get students to look up at the horizon, the big picture, beyond their daily challenges in school. The college gives them the tools to excel at any level. We hope that they will be inspired to embrace the challenge to lead. We have some really distinguished leaders, and Sewell Chan is one of the foremost. So let me tell you a little bit about him, our guest today. Sewell is the editor of the Texas Tribune. If you haven't checked out the Texas Tribune website yet, I'd urge you to do so. It's fascinating reading. Even if you're not from Texas, it's fascinating reading. He joined the Texas Tribune as editor-in-chief just last October. Before that, he was a deputy managing editor and then the editorial page editor at the Los Angeles Times. He oversaw coverage there that was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing in 2021. He worked at the New York Times from 2004 to 2018 as a Metro reporter, Washington correspondent, deputy op-ed editor, and international news editor. And he began his career at the Washington Post in 2000. 3 distinguished news operations, 3 preeminent news operations. Actually 4, if we include the Texas Tribune now at this point. He's a child of immigrants. He's first gen, like many of you out there, like me. He was the first in his family to graduate from college. He has a degree in social studies from Harvard. Some of you may have heard about that. That's the UNL of the East. He has a master's in political science from Oxford. I don't know what that would be in comparison to UNL, but that's over across the pond.
It's a state school.
It's a state school. Okay, all right, there we go. He studied on a British Marshall Scholarship. He's a member of PEN America, the Council on Foreign Relations, and numerous journalism organizations. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Chan. He's going to talk to us for a little bit. Here's the format. He's going to talk to us for about 15 minutes. Then we'll have a panel of students. We'll come up and ask him some questions. I'm going to hand out these note cards. If you have a question, we will have time after the panel for your questions. And I'd ask somebody to collect these cards and bring them on up to me, okay? So I'm going to pass these out while he talks to us.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I, first of all, want to start by thanking Professor Weber for that very kind introduction and Professor Bender for making available this space and in his class and at UNL. This is my first time in Nebraska, and I can happily report that I've been really impressed and overwhelmed by everything I've seen here. I visit a lot of journalism schools and talk to a lot of journalism professors, and the sense of excitement and purpose that I feel here is really pretty off the charts. And I also love the kind of modern facility, and I'm just blown away by the diversity and complexity of the programs offered here, including in visual journalism, data journalism, multimedia, broadcast, etc. I really am also grateful to the Seline family for their support of this lecture series and very honored to be part of it. So I want to talk to you today about nonprofit journalism in a polarized era. And maybe the topic is itself polarizing, you'll have to tell me. But I want to start a little bit by talking about the shape of the nonprofit news field and why I care so passionately about it and why I've chosen to really, spend really the next big chunk of my career in this field. So nonprofit journalism in the United States actually has a long history. If you think about publications like Mother Jones, or or if you think about NPR and public media stations, nonprofit news does have a long history. But I think when we're thinking about nonprofit news today, we're really talking about a whole generation of newsrooms that basically emerged around the time of and after the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. So the Texas Tribune's founding story is that in 2009, as newspapers were shrinking and journalists were being laid off in very large numbers, and if we're being honest, the industry has never really fully recovered from that kind of economic turmoil around the crisis. Our three founders identified a real need for high-quality, free, nonprofit journalism in Texas. And these founders were John Thornton, who's an investor and venture capitalist, Evan Smith, who is our CEO, and Ross Ramsey, who is a longtime State House reporter himself and now a political columnist for the Texas Tribune. And these three guys started off with just an idea. They literally were, they did not have an office. They worked out of cafes. They had to get office supplies from Staples. I have seen the articles of incorporation, and I am really struck by both the ambition of their vision, of our vision now, and also by the very, very scarce resources they had at the time to carry it out. Today, the Texas Tribune is an organization that employs 75 people with an annual budget of about $11 million and 50 journalists. So how did we do that? And what exactly are we doing with those resources? First of all, we started off as a news organization really focused on what we can do best, which is fair, impartial, meticulous, detailed coverage of state government, politics, and public policy, particularly with an accountability lens and frame. And that lens means that from the beginning, although we've been interested in politics and cover races very thoroughly, we're also interested in public policy. Who has power? Who doesn't? How is power exercised or experienced by citizens in our state? The differences across, Texas is huge, as you know, also has very interesting east-west kind of dimensions, just like Nebraska does. Obviously has vast territory that's rural, but also a heavily urban population now. 75% of our state lives in the four largest metro areas of Houston, Dallas, which includes Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Austin. And from the beginning, our mission has been very, very clear. Now, that mission has expanded over time. When we were started, one of the things that distinguished the Texas Tribune was that we were not trying to be all things to all people. We don't cover food, though we like to eat. We don't cover sports, even if we enjoy watching them. We don't cover, the live music scene in Austin, even though it is amazing. And, our mission from the beginning has been to provide journalism that the market, frankly, might not easily provide as a commercial product. And we really, have just grown and grown from there. And, the state has gotten a lot more complicated. You may have seen, news of our state government in action, which we can talk about. But really, our mission has stayed the same. And we broadened that mission over time to include a joint venture with ProPublica, which I think is really, in many ways, kind of the best journalism organization in the United States right now. And ProPublica's mission is all investigations, accountability journalism all the time. The Texas Tribune started that way too. There was a major shooting at an Army base in our first year, I believe it was at Fort Hood. And because we did not have an immediate angle on state government, we didn't cover it. And that has become more complex over time. There's a lot of breaking news. I can just give an example from my tenure that there was, a hostage standoff at a synagogue in Fort Worth. And, we had to ask ourselves, what is it that we can bring to the table? We don't have a ton of people. We're not best equipped to, talk to the police and get to the scene right away and talk to all the people. But we are really well equipped to provide context, analysis, history, and kind of put things in a broader perspective. And that's what we do. We're very good at breaking news when it's political. And when there's non-political breaking news, we try to provide context. So one of the things I really would like to share before I talk about the polarization of our era is really the experience of the winter storm of February of 2021. Texas really experienced a series of weather events like none in modern history. The entire state pretty much froze over. And then, of course, the electrical grid failed in the vast majority of the state. And people were left without power and, in many cases, water for days. Unfortunately, tragically, hundreds of people died. The official death toll is, I think, to about 250 plus. But a lot of estimates have said that the true number could be as high as 700, and we may never know that true number. During that time, the Texas Tribune really rose to the challenge. Our journalists worked day and night from throughout the state. We had to organize ways of getting kind of water and food to people. Obviously, folks had to work off their, cell phones, their batteries, generators in some cases, checking into hotels because, it was a little bit spotty. Parts of downtown Austin remained on the grid, for example, but most of the city did not. And, for me, I think that, this institution's coverage of the Tribune is one of the things that actually made me want to come and work here, because folks are so dedicated about service in the public mission. And among the many pieces of journalism we published around that time, we did a lot of explanation about the electrical grid and supply in Texas. The grid in our state is not connected to the rest of the nation's for very interesting reasons. There's been a lot of deregulation of the energy markets. We explained all that. But crucially, we started we just dived right into the public mission, and we started an SMS texting service that thousands of people signed up for, in which we provided kind of life-saving information and updates, and even responded to individual readers during that time. We also launched an investigative series about the impact of carbon monoxide poisoning, which accounted for several dozen deaths in Texas. These were folks who were using kind of portable generators or diesel-fueled generators, and they weren't aware, in many cases because the products weren't sufficiently regulated, about the potential dangers. And they died, in some cases in their homes or in their cars, which is truly, truly awful, and we documented how those deaths were preventable. So when I think about, nonprofit journalism, I'm just really so excited about our mission. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to do nonprofit journalism in a polarized era. And I want to really be frank about my own background and my own perspectives. In many ways, I definitely feel the ultimate imposter syndrome because I'm not a Texan. And, I'm from the coast of America. I'm from an immigrant family. I grew up literally on the edge of the American continent in Queens. And, I spent a lot of my career, in fact, the first 18 years of my career, mainly in DC or New York. And after the events of 2016 and even beyond, I felt a great urgency as a journalist, as an American citizen, as someone who feels very grateful and loyal to be, to live in the United States. I felt compelled to be in places and talk to people different from what I had experienced. I truly believe that American democracy, can't be revitalized without strong press institutions. And I also believe that we cannot be getting our news solely from newsrooms in DC and New York. I really believe that more than ever, especially since moving to Texas. I am not in any way disrespecting the great investigative journalism that is carried out in New York and DC, but we're a huge nation. And what I've seen happen in journalism over the past, several decades really, is kind of a withering of especially state and local journalism. And so we today have a news landscape in which a lot of folks are getting their news from cable. And that means that they're watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN. And a lot of what they're getting is opinion rather than original journalism and reportage. A lot of what they're getting is kind of, frankly, news that is highly, if not sensationalized, at least conflict is emphasized and drama is emphasized, but sometimes often not the lives of ordinary people and citizens. And frankly, it's a distorted perspective because it's a perspective really told from major cities that are very, very wealthy and powerful, and not necessarily from, the kind of the rest of America. Now, Austin's itself a big city. I'm not pretending by any means to be in a small town, but I really think it was so important to me to come to, UNL because I wanted to talk to people from a really diverse and varied state. And I've already talked to a bunch of students here about coming from agricultural communities and rural communities and places that are not well represented in America. So polarization is not a new phenomenon to any of you. We live in many ways in a hyper-polarized time. There's a lot of debates about what caused that polarization. Is it economic? Because inequality has risen a lot in America over the last 40 years, inequality of wealth, inequality of income. Is the polarization because of technology? Because social media has tended to sort people into these filter bubbles and into these kind of siloed realities where we are exposed to information. People are, instead of the news shaping people's views, people are finding the news that affirms their existing views. And I think that's so dangerous, right? I always have been interested in reading, things I don't know about. I think curiosity is at the heart of our craft. And I'm very, very worried about, people seeking out information that fits the preconceptions that they already have. So it's technological causes. There's also something that's been called affective polarization, which is that it's not even polarization anymore that's necessarily because of people studying public policy. and actually looking at the issues, but rather like what team you're on. And any of us who follow sports knows exactly what team loyalties look like. I see a bunch of Nebraska sweatshirts out here. But it's really dangerous, I think, when it's applied to politics, right? Because politics isn't ultimately a sport. It isn't a game, and it isn't theater. And I think to the extent that the media have covered politics at times through the lens of kind of conflict and drama and theater and entertainment, I think those are giant problems, because politics is ultimately about, the impact of government on people's lives, and that's really not something that's trifling at all. And so there's this whole frame of affective polarization right now, where people are more voting because they kind of hate the other team than that they can then are able to actually concretely make the argument for why their policies or their politicians are favored. So I want to talk for just a moment, and then we'll open it up to discussion, a little bit about what nonprofit news can do in this polarized age. I think one of the things I'd point out is that there was a Pew Research Center study today that was very interesting. I sent it to Joe and Michelle right before, earlier this morning, in fact, that said that 1 in 5 state government reporters in the United States now works for a nonprofit newsroom. And I just want to let that sink in, just how huge that is, because these newsrooms, again, did not exist 15 years ago, by and large. Today, they're proliferating everywhere. I had lunch today with Matt and Matthew of the Flatwater Free Press, and I heard about their model. I'm also aware of a nonprofit effort called By State's Newsroom with the Nebraska Examiner. And of course, I'm thinking about student-produced journalism like Nebraska News Service and other publications that you put out here at the school. And I think it's very interesting because a lot of public media stations are actually based now at universities. And so universities are providing, news coverage. Why do I think that nonprofit news is particularly well-suited to help us in a polarized age? I think for several reasons. First of all, nonprofit news, the model is not based on scale. We're not trying to, get a gazillion eyeballs and get a global audience. We're trying to get an audience of people, everyday people, who are in the communities and states and regions actually affected by state government. And I think that's really, really important, because the levels of government that we're closest with, whether it's a town, a city, or a state, have a lot more impact on our lives usually than the federal government. But again, all the attention has shifted toward the federal and away from state and local. So I'm very heartened to see newsrooms, kind of pop up around the country, dedicated to covering state government, and there are a ton. Recently there was a convening of nonprofit newsrooms, and I was just blown away by the energy that's coming out of places like West Virginia, Montana, Connecticut, Mississippi, that all are, pursuing this model of doing nonpartisan journalism in the public interest. And I guess the thing I'd say about the kind of polarization of our day is that we are really trying to be a newsroom that is producing the truth and pursuing facts, but an ethical pursuit in service of democracy, which happens to be exactly what is on the wall upstairs, and why I think the mission of this school is so relevant and so up to date. And, there's a lot of discussion right now about what it means to be kind of a nonpartisan newsroom. And I guess what I would say ultimately is that nonpartisan does not mean non-thinking, as my CEO likes to say. Nonpartisan doesn't mean that, every truth is equivalent. But nonpartisan also means that we're not serving any party, sect, or faction. We're serving our readers. We're serving our taxpayers. We're serving the residents of our state. And I try to approach every story from the lens of accountability. Who is in power? What actions are they taking? And how do those actions affect or fail to affect the lives of residents? And I think to be a newsroom in service of democracy does mean that we are pro-engagement. We are pro-people being informed. We are pro-people being engaged with their government. We are pro-civil and respectful discourse. And yes, we are pro-voting. We are pro-people taking part in their democracy, going to meetings, getting involved in their communities, showing up, and yes, even representing themselves in the electoral sphere. And our job is not to sway any election or to favor any candidate. I'm frankly suspicious of all candidates for public office, but rather it is to serve. And I think that's kind of what journalism needs to do in this hyperpolarized era. You know, there is such a temptation to kind of play into the kind of narrative frames that are around so much of politics today, which include the tribalism and the identity-based politics, and really kind of leaning into, you know, frankly, the extremism of our age. And I would just urge us as journalists to really, really be wary of that, because ultimately what we bring to the table as journalists is our curiosity and also our empathy. And you really need the two, right, for any news organization, I think, to truly succeed. You have to be curious, which means you have to always search for the facts, be rigorous in your methods, look at the documents, read every goddamn page, as Robert Caro's editor told him. And you've also got to be empathetic, though, because the curiosity you can be curious about, like, you know, things without really caring that much about them. And I don't think that that's our mission either. I think we have to be curious, but we also need to care. And that's where empathy comes in. I am not trying to say that any of the issues dividing America today are easy to resolve. They're not. They're not. They're deeply difficult, in fact. But I don't believe that we can cover them accurately and with sufficient perspective and context if we don't start from a place of empathy, which means listening to people deeply about their life experiences, asking about what they've experienced in their lives, their worries, their anxieties, their hopes, their dreams, and trying to get to a place of understanding. Because if we don't do that, then really there's a great peril to our democracy that even journalism cannot fully solve. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our questions.
Okay. You can grab a seat if you'd like, and we'll ask the students to come up who are going to ask. Come on up. Come on. I'm going to introduce three students from a class that we have here in the college about these nonprofit journalism organizations. Let me make sure I've got your materials here, guys. So, they are Ariana Joy Kobler, right here, Ahmad Zaki Sadeki, right here, and Rita Shmakova, right here. And I will ask you guys to ask one question each, and we'll go through, and then we'll open it up, and then we can come back for more.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming to UNL. It's a great pleasure. Firstly, what are some of the best hireable skills, which as a college student we may or may not learn, because since we're all college students?
Can you all hear me?
Can you give me back the mic? Yeah.
Ariana, that's a really great question. I think it's really important that folks are learning the technical skills, and I know there's a lot of emphasis right now on technology, on social media, on using a lot of software, frankly, that I never learned how to use when it comes to, you know, Photoshop and video editing and all that. But I think ultimately, you know, one of the things that we have to do as journalists is, you know, it sounds so obvious, but communicate. And that really means kind of getting to the essence of things. You know, I think that a big part of journalism is actually breaking down complexity and being in the service. We're ultimately, in some ways, partly translators. And we take things that are dense or complex, and we try to break them down and explain things to people. And I think that the ability to kind of absorb complexity and then to kind of synthesize and explain things in ways that are clear and accessible is kind of at the heart of what we do as journalists. So I would really emphasize that part. The ability to kind of really write succinctly, and it's the foundation. I'm not saying that it's all about the text. We can talk a lot about data journalism and visual journalism and all the forms of journalism we really need right now to tell stories effectively, but I think that the ability to write clearly is still kind of at the foundation.
Yeah, so thank you again for coming today. And one of the questions was, for me actually was, so in your comment to New York Times when you joined the Texas Tribune was said that it was something new and something unexpected. So being in the office about like half a year now, I think, what's your opinion on the general organization of the media and of the company you're working with? And yeah, like, what are you thinking? What do you expect? What you didn't expect so far?
I think we have a really strong organizational culture. You know, our staff is pretty young. Most people are under the age of 35. I know that seems really old, but not when you're older. I think the sense of mission is very, very high. I think like all news organizations, you know, journalists right now are asking questions they didn't ask when I was growing up. Journalists want to work in fair and equitable workplaces. There's a lot of emphasis being driven by folks your age and a little bit older on work-life balance, on digital overload, on information overload, on having, you know, being able to kind of manage the complexity of information. Your generation actually gives me a lot of hope, because I think, you know, the internet kind of crept up on folks like me, and before we knew it, we were inundated by all the alerts, all the notifications, all the likes, etc. And I think that I often see in younger journalists and younger employees kind of a real awareness of the necessity to shut it off at times. And it can be hard to say shut it off. We're in the news. We have to react right away when things happen, right? But the truth is that actually a lot of news is not necessarily planned, but like, you know, there isn't breaking news at every single moment. I mean, there is if you're Bloomberg or the New York Times, but if you're the Texas Tribune, you know, we have a breaking news team, but then we have all our policy areas, and we try to plan things out in advance. And we're trying to create a sustainable workplace, because that's a big part of it right now. There's a lot of worry about whether jobs in journalism can be sustained. I believe they can be, and we can talk about that. But I also think it's really important that journalism treat people better, because historically there has been a lot of churn and burn in journalism, and a lot of young people who get into the field, do a ton of work, but then kind of get burned out and leave. And how is that helping matters if that's the case? So I think becoming an organization that really puts our employees first, puts the readers first, is a really, really important part of it. Excuse me. I'm not that surprised by the hyperpolarized environment in Texas. It's kind of what I expected going in. I guess my biggest fear is not that folks won't. I think we're well respected and well read in the state. I guess my greatest fear is that there are, you know, I worry sometimes that journalists are mostly communicating with those who are already highly engaged or highly interested in the news or in politics. And we need to do a better job, all of us, at reaching out to those who aren't well engaged or those who might be misinformed. And when I was coming up in journalism, we kind of assumed not necessarily that people were well informed, but that the general kind of information base is kind of uniform across society, and it's not. It's really not. A lot of people, you know, including in, you know, your parents' generation or older, have been just subjected to a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Let's be honest about that. Let's be honest that there are bad actors who, you know, really have their profit model is kind of, you know, creating hoaxes or conspiracies or really rubbish and nonsense. And that doesn't come from just one side of the spectrum. It can come from all parts of the political spectrum. I do think it's pronounced on the far right now. But, you know, that really, really worries me, because if people don't, you know, somebody said something to me recently that really, really shook me. And it was the idea that even saying that one is a journalist can now elicit skepticism or even like, not anger, but like doubts. Like, you're a journalist? And, you know, I think that we need to say we're journalists, you know, with pride and a sense of purpose. But that also means that we have to defend our profession against accusations of, like, fake news. It does not mean dismiss those accusations. I think we have to understand what exactly is being criticized and have the humility and openness to, like, listen deeply to what people are saying. But I think it also means standing up for journalism as an essential practice of democracy. And that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. We have been talking about media polarization, misinformation, disinformation today. So you have been in this field for around 20 years now, from a variety of sources that are available for everyone at the moment. What do you suggest for everyone to, or how do people get or ensure that they get a healthy news diet?
Well, first of all, Ahmad, I love your metaphor of the diet, because I absolutely have come to believe that. I don't think that any of us should turn just to a single source or even a small set of sources for news. We have to have a healthy diet, and that includes a lot of variety, frankly. Mostly greens, not too much meat. I'm just joking. But it does include, really, like, we've been eating junk food. I mean, and our minds are kind of being, trashed by bad sources of information. So part of my advice is stop doom scrolling. Get off Twitter when you don't need to be on it. Stop checking in on the updates, and do more to kind of engage with people, engage with books, engage with your fellow classmates. It's so common for us, and I'm part of this, right? Like, when I leave this lecture hall today, this afternoon, I'll be checking my phone and seeing what's come in and what Slack messages have landed. But it's important to not let those notifications kind of dominate our whole lives and experiences. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment and then not to see the bigger picture, which is partly what this lecture series is about. And so, I think people do need to consume a lot of sources, and yes, be skeptical. But skepticism isn't the same as conspiracy. I feel that there are some people who are so mistrustful right now that they're like, anything the mainstream media says must be false. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of different kinds of mainstream media, like a big range. And so when people are like fake news, or they just try to attribute to the media, even the term the media is so broad, and I think it's kind of meaningless, right? Are we talking about investigative journalists, who I think do some of the most important work in America, or are we talking about people who appear on cable news in suits and are yelling at each other all the time? The latter part is, it's commentary. People have the right to do that. We have the right to watch it and the ability, but I don't think that we should confuse that for news. News has to be about original reporting and facts. That means getting out there, talking to people, reading the documents, submitting public records requests. And you should respect sources that do those things. It's not about the prestige. I worked at giant places, and I do read them all the time. But I try not to limit myself to journalism, for example, from one country. Although, unfortunately, I only read English. I do try to read, UK sources. I try to read sources, BBC. I try to get perspectives from outside the US. I try to get perspectives from outside of the coast, which I talked about earlier. I try to read, a big variety of political, news and opinion, including like the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is very conservative, but it's important for me to understand. Of course, it's not that conservative now to compare it to everything that's even further to the right, but it is an important part of the diet, and that's what I would urge on everyone. I never say read X brand because it's really good. I don't each institution has to prove itself to its readers all the time. We can't take trust for granted, right? But I think but that doesn't mean that we should never trust. I think you should trust a publication if they publish corrections, if they have an ethics policy, if they have guard against conflicts of interest, if they're transparent about who they are and who's funding them. We list every donor on our website. It doesn't matter how small the donation. And the people I work with have raised $100 million for nonprofit journalism over 13 years. And the biggest single donor of that was about $2 or $2.5 million. So we don't, in other words, there's not like some mega donor who wrote one huge check. And I'm not disrespecting organizations that may be reliant at the start on a single donor. But I think that whatever organization you look at who's funding them, look at who runs them, look at who owns them, and try to form your decisions about what to trust based on the kind of processes and institutions that are in place. Is that helpful?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much.
Okay, before we proceed with the questions, we'll do another round from the panel here, but I want to come down and collect cards. If you have written a question on the card, please hand it to me. If you haven't written a question, but you have a question, write it now, and I'll come down and collect those, and then we'll go through another round, okay?
Oh, okay. You have been in the journalism industry professionally for about 22 years. What are some qualities that you have noticed are very influential to a person's success in the industry?
I think, first of all, hard work. Integrity really matters. Ultimately, we're only as good as our word, and the words we write, they have to be truthful, they have to be accurate, they should be in context. I think, again, go back to curiosity and empathy. I think those are probably the most important ones. You know, I'm not talking about, you'll notice that I'm not talking about like fluency with data, even though that's really important, or Twitter ability, even though that arguably can be important sometimes. But, you know, it really is about the fundamentals, I think. And I think that's what you learn in an environment like this one.
You mentioned that the importance of nonprofit journalism, and I'm wondering, in the upcoming elections, do you think the nonprofits have to be the ones who will help people navigate the general environment and like formulate the opinions, or like can we have more trust in them than we have in like other publications?
You know, that's a really great question, you know, Rita. I mean, I think that one thing I've encountered at the Texas Tribune is there are some people out there who won't trust the New York Times or the Washington Post. And even though I have great respect for those institutions where I worked, immense respect, and I think they are very trustworthy. But the fact is that having New York or Washington in their names might not be very popular right now. As it probably won't surprise some of you. You know, you may have families or be from communities where mainstream news is mistrusted, right? So I wouldn't say ever that like the nonprofits are the answer. I kind of avoid that because I don't think journalism has one future. It has multiple futures, and that includes commercial media, public media, and nonprofit media. But I think that to the extent that nonprofits can bring the news closer to people where they are and where they live, like it can help to, you know, provide a lot of clarity. I also want to point out that a lot of what we do is service journalism. I'm so proud of the voter guides that we publish. We tell people, you know, we have a tool where you can enter your address and find out all your elected officials and which, you know, get information about where to vote, you know, but also get information to kind of understand, you know, every public official, every statewide official in Texas that we refer to in any story, we automatically have a link, and that goes to like our coverage of that person. And so it automatically, if you want to dig further, you can find out a lot more about that official and their track record, and, you know, whether or not, you know, you want to support them. And again, it's not our job to recommend or to make decisions for people. It's to inform them and empower them to make good decisions.
Earlier you named some media organizations that could possibly be opinion-based. So I wanted to ask you, is this whole mistrust towards media just because of the TV, or it's TV and the print press?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Ahmad, that it's specific to a medium, but I do think that the kind of balance between news and opinion is an important one, and I think we're too heavily oriented toward opinion right now. It might be ironic that I'm saying that because 2 big chapters of my career have been spent doing opinion journalism, and I really respect that side of the aisle. And there's a lot that goes into high-quality opinion journalism, including fact-checking. I always like to, you know, quote the Daniel Patrick Moynihan adage that you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own set of facts. And these days, I feel, unfortunately, that's been kind of undermined. People cherry-pick the facts that match their opinions and disregard all other evidence that doesn't fit conveniently into their pre-existing theory, and that's not too good. Now, I think there's a lot of high-quality opinion journalism out there. I certainly tried to produce that when I was at the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. But I do think generally right now the balance between news and opinion has gotten out of whack. You know, when I remember, I won't cite any cable network in particular, but there's one cable network I'm thinking of that used to kind of provide, was best known for 24/7 kind of pioneering original journalism coverage, and that usually meant having like cameras like seemingly everywhere. Like they had some connection to a news station, whether it was in Nebraska or in Pakistan, and somehow could get you images. I think you all know which network I'm talking about, which cable provider organization I'm talking about. Started in the 1980s and 90s, and you know, I think it's moved away from that. And again, like TV, there's an awful sameness in TV right now, where like, but it's not limited to TV, you know, but it's just like people in suits shouting at each other, and I'm not interested in that anymore, and I kind of tune it off, and I kind of hope other people will too.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we have a couple questions from the floor. And this one's quite appropriate to what we were just discussing about, given your experience with editorials. What makes a great and important editorial? And a subsidiary question, if I might add, I believe a lot of the nonprofits steer away from editorial endorsements of candidates for legal reasons. Are you in the same sort of bind at the Tribune?
Terrific questions. So what is an editorial, right? We wrestled with this so much at the LA Times. Like, what does it mean to be an editorial board? What does that even mean? Is it like a wooden board? Is it a, so, you know, editorials, I think, originally started off as institutional statements of principle. And they usually, historically, at newspapers, often reflected the owner's or the publisher's kind of vision. So oftentimes editorials were really grounded in kind of what the community is concerned about. And I think at their best, editorials can still play that role of really being, you know, great editorial writing is founded on reporting. Great editorial writing is founded on the search for truth and facts. And it's not grounded in ideology. And that's why I was so proud to be associated with my former colleague, Robert Greene, who won a Pulitzer Prize last year for, you know, writing about criminal justice. And he had been doing that for a decade, basically. And I really, you know, saw that and kind of nominated him for that prize and that recognition. I'm so glad he won, because one of the things that distinguishes Robert's work is that it's not grounded in ideology. He's not simply reducible to a slogan. He looks at criminal justice from everyone's perspective. Victims, people who are involved, who are themselves incarcerated, public defenders, prosecutors, the police, and he really brought to it such an excellent level of reporting. Now, he did draw recommendations, and that's where editorials are not news, because editorials go one step further and say, this is what we think about it. But I think ultimately good editorial writing should really invite a dialogue with readers rather than telling them what to think, but really more like shaping how they think. As for endorsements and the like, that's absolutely true. You know, IRS tax-exempt organizations are required, I'm pretty sure, to be nonpartisan. And so, you know, it would be, I think, problematic if we were to kind of, you know, take partisan positions. So I think there are legal reasons, but to be honest, it's more the editorial reason. You know, I don't think the Texas Tribune should have an opinion section. Like, it's not the right fit for us and our brand and our audience right now. It's such a hyper-polarized state. I'd be very worried if Texas Tribune were associated with, like, editorial positions, because I think that would dilute what we stand for. But again, we're a 13-year-old nonprofit newsroom. If you're the LA Times or the New York Times, you've got a different set of considerations, a much longer history, people who are used to editorials. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but I can tell you the answer for my current context.
That is absolutely fascinating. I mean, you know, if you have an editorial page and half of your readers don't agree with it, you're going to lose those readers. At least there's a possibility of that. So maybe it's a good thing not to have one.
Can I tell a quick story? After the 2020 election, in fact, the Sunday, right after the election results and outcome were announced, I said to my staff, you know, we hear all the time from Trump supporters who feel under-reflected in our opinion pages, underrepresented, or even ignored. And their candidate has just lost, and we need to give them their say. And we published a full page of letters, all of them verified, fact-checked. You know, we called the people involved, made sure they were who they said they were, all of them who had supported President Trump and were deeply disappointed, and perhaps even afraid or angry about the outcomes. And we gave a full page over to their point of view. And when I said on Twitter that we had done that, I got a huge amount of blowback. And I'm empathetic to all sides. You know, I heard from readers who were like, you are platforming extremists and you're giving them a platform. Actually, no one we published was an extremist, or at least not in what they said. They were like, you know, you're sanctioning and kind of endorsing. I'm like, no, we didn't endorse. Actually, well, we did run an endorsement. It was of Joe Biden. But you know, even kind of giving, you know, the other side a lot of space. And for me, it was important that we did it after the election. You know, it was after the election. Like, the outcome had been decided. Like, let people have their say. And I think the fact that, like, it was hard to do that for one day, it actually kind of disturbed me, because, you know, California has so many people that the absolute number, there are actually more people in California, get this, who voted for Donald Trump than people in Texas in 2020. By a hair's breadth. It's like 6 million in each state. Obviously, Texas, Trump won overwhelmingly, and California, Biden won overwhelmingly. But California has so many people. There are millions and millions of Trump voters in the state. And, you know, they needed to be heard, because, you know, those state color-coded maps are very misleading. They don't, you know, they really obscure a lot of the rural and urban, you know, divides.
Of course, that was at the LA Times where you did that full page thing. I guess you would not need to do something like that at the Tribune unless you opened your pages to
Well, we don't run letters.
Yeah, you don't run letters either. Why do you not run letters? That's interesting.
I like letters a lot, but I think, letters are really kind of a newspaper sort of thing. I think, there's a lot of places to find readers' comments. So I don't think that's where our best effort is spent right now.
Related question, how do you provide neutral political news to your audience? Is it, in fact, neutral?
There's a lot of words that we use in journalism: objectivity, impartiality, neutrality. And I think that there are valid concerns that have been raised about each of these concepts, and they're kind of distinct. I guess I would tend to avoid the word neutral, if I can be completely honest, because neutrality and impartiality kind of really assume that we're at this distance and that we're not really affected by what happens. And I think that's actually been a problem for journalism, that we seem very removed or elitist or detached. And that's not really what we should be saying, right? But that doesn't mean I don't believe in fairness, accuracy, and context. So I tend to emphasize those three words over impartiality, neutrality, and objectivity. And we can have a longer discussion about that. I think it's a discussion worth having. But I tend to emphasize fairness, accuracy, context.
What were some of the early marketing strategies used to promote the Texas Tribune?
I do not know the whole history, but I can say that live events have been a big part of what we've done from the very beginning and have been really, really popular over the years and provide a substantial revenue stream for us. So we've always had a lot of talks with public officials, and we have had an annual Texas Tribune Festival, which is one of the biggest ideas festivals in the nation every September. We're going to have it again this year. I welcome some of you to come to Austin for it. And it's spaced 6 months away from South by Southwest for a reason. We've always engaged that way. We've always had sponsors or basically entities or companies that want to have advertising on our website. We do that. It's obviously all disclosed. We also have really leaned into newsletters, especially in recent years, and our premium newsletter reaches, really, I think, tens and tens of thousands of readers right now, and that's kind of a daily product. And a lot of you are probably hearing about the newsletter boom that's happening right now. It might turn into a bust at some point. We'll see, but newsletters have been very durable because it's actually a way of reaching your readers directly instead of having this kind of intermediary like a social media platform.
What do you mean by polarized world?
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I meant we talk about polarization on many levels, including globally, but I guess I meant in the U.S. context, the tendency toward hyperpartisanship.
How do you feel about the upcoming generation coming into a polarized age? And what can people now do to change this?
Yeah. Wow, huge questions. First of all, I think media literacy has to kind of be taught. And I think, frankly, everyone should be learning it, not just journalism students. And people of all ages should be learning it. And actually, the News Literacy Project, which is a wonderful nonprofit that works in these issues, I think they're developing programs that actually help older readers navigate misinformation. I think it's really a mistake, actually, to believe that younger people are more likely to be susceptible to misinformation. Younger people are often much more savvy, actually, about navigating all these different apps and incoming streams of misinformation. I often worry about the older generation for whom, this kind of onslaught on deluge of information, has kind of crept up over the years. And people's ability to discern what is high quality from low quality has kind of eroded. So I think media literacy is a big part of it. Repeat the last part of the question one more time.
What can people now do to change this?
Yeah, to change it. More journalism is a big part of it. I know a lot of you are studying advertising and public relations. And I think that, and I'm realistic, most graduates of journalism schools don't become journalists, but I think it's immensely valuable that you're studying journalism because, studying being able to produce accurate, truthful communication is really, really important no matter what field you end up in, law, medicine, public relations. And I think that, for example, if you go into PR, you should have the same ethical standards that journalists do. You're obviously doing PR communications for a specific purpose and for a client, but ultimately you have to be committed to the truth. And I think that, there are people committed to factual information and people who are not. And we have to align ourselves with the former camp in all areas.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. So, Ariana, could you take the mic again and ask another question?
The staff at the Texas Tribune is fairly large. I looked on your website, and there's nearly 100 of them. how important is it to be able to connect with all of them since you are the editor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we're all thinking about workplace communication right now. Our staff has been largely remote since March of 2020. We did reopen, I believe I only joined in the fall of last year, so I can't say for certain when we reopened. But we're reopened right now. It's on a voluntary basis. And I think it's very hard right now for all of us. You know, this classroom, I'm assuming, setting did not exist a year ago. We've all been through, frankly, a pretty massive kind of disruption and trauma. And I think reestablishing communication is really important. It's actually one reason why I wanted to come here and meet students, because I haven't done that in years. And, you know, in the workplace, it's super important because, you know, we're in this time right now where so much is happening on Zoom. The number of meetings has really exploded. It's been documented. We all have too many meetings. We all have Zoom fatigue. So how do you find ways to get people together, engaging with ideas? I think that's the most important thing I try to do. So I do that by meeting teams. I do that by meeting folks one-on-one. And, you know, I certainly, you know, 100 people is a lot of people, but I've worked at much larger organizations as well. You know, if you work at a 2,000 person organization, you probably can't meet everyone. But at 100, you can definitely still, you know, get to know everyone and try to understand how they fit into the organization. I think that's what good leaders do, understand the role everyone has to play and see how they fit together.
Yeah, one of my questions, honestly. So being the first gen, what can you tell the current students? What advice can you give them in terms of like being in school and starting their career?
Yeah, so I think if you're in the first, you know, we didn't really have this term first gen when I was in college. And, you know, as the term emerged, I was like, that's me. I would say, first of all, give yourselves a pat on the back, because I think being the first person in your family to go to college, to graduate from college, is a big deal. And it is a privilege. It's also a privilege that you've worked very, very hard for. So first of all, congratulations, and then pay it forward. You know, I feel that coming from, you know, an immigrant working class family, I always felt a little bit like an outsider, and I think that actually helped my career in journalism. I think that, you know, first-gen students have a lot to offer because you've seen kind of, you know, the promise of opportunity in your lives. And unfortunately, a lot of folks in our society don't have that opportunity. Only about a third of Americans even have a 4-year college degree. So yes, it's a privilege, and we need to acknowledge that and own it. But then we need to do something to try to pay it forward, right, and create opportunities for others.
Ahmad, you get the last question.
Yeah. There is an existing opinion that media organizations are putting a lot of effort to actually shift the ideological composition of the public on certain matters. Now, from a journalistic point of view, how scary does that look?
Well, I want to ask a little bit more about the framing of that question. Media organizations are trying to shift the ideological composition?
Yeah.
Do you mean like getting people to vote a certain way, or do you mean like getting people to like have different...
Think the way they want them to think.
Yeah, so I've already spoken about how I think that's a real danger and not what I'm trying to do or what we're trying to do at the Texas Tribune. I'm not, you know, in a way, sometimes I wish, like, I don't actually think that most of these organizations are actually getting people to try to think differently. I think they're trying to really excite and rile up and really like inspire perhaps or motivate the people who already agree with them. And again, we've all, you know, been fans of sports teams. We all understand what it means to root for your team, but politics shouldn't be like that, because one side doesn't have all the truth and one side doesn't have all the facts. And believe me, you do not want one side winning all the time. I just don't think that's healthy, no matter whether you're D or R or an independent or anything else. So, you know, I actually think that a lot of media organizations are making a mistake. But maybe their economic model suggests that it's profitable, frankly, to, you know, speak to your base and get folks excited. You know, but again, I would just urge everyone here, be skeptical of that. Like, what is this organization's motives? And again, like, if their business model is like all based on getting folks worked up, like, is that really something that you want to be a customer of?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking Sunil Chan for joining us. And I thank you all for coming.
Thanks for the great questions.